I woke up on her floor and told the first lie of my life that mattered. I don't remember anything. There are 3 truths about that night. The first one took 4 months to come out. The second took almost a year. The third one I already knew at 6:10 that morning, lying still with my eyes shut, waiting for her to wake up. There are 3 truths about that night. The first one took 4 months to come out. The second took almost a year. The third one I already knew at 6:10 that morning, lying still with my eyes shut, waiting for her to wake up. Let me give you the room first, because I have gone back to that room more times than I have gone back to any other place on earth. Her apartment was on the 2nd floor of a 3-story walk-up on Butler Street in Pittsburgh, in a neighborhood called Lawrenceville, in a building put up in 1912 by somebody who did not believe in insulation. Hardwood floors that had been refinished so many times they had gone soft. One window that faced the courtyard. A radiator that knocked twice before it gave you anything. I was on the floor with a throw blanket over my legs that I had not put there. My shoes were off. Somebody had taken my shoes off and set them by the door toes, pointing out the way you do for a person you intend to let leave. She was on the bed, sitting up on top of the covers, still in her clothes from the night before. Knees pulled all the way up to her chest with both arms wrapped around them. I want you to remember that. The knees. It is going to come back. The light in that apartment at 6 in the morning came in gray and low, and it made everything look like a photograph of itself. She was looking at me. Not sleepy, not hungover, though she should have been. Awake in a way that told me she had been awake a while and had spent that while doing something with her face, arranging it, getting it ready. And she said, "Hey." And I said, "Hey." And then I said the thing. I said, "God." I don't remember anything after the second bottle. I watched it land. I want to be honest about that, because a lot of men tell this kind of story like the important part happened to them. It did not happen to me. I did it. I watched her face come apart very slightly and then put itself back together, and it took maybe a second and a half, and in that second and a half I could have said anything else in the English language, and this would be a different story. She said, "Yeah, me neither." That was a lie too. I did not know it was a lie for 11 more months. She got up and made coffee, and we talked about a show we were both watching, and neither of us mentioned the whiskey or the takeout containers still on the counter, or the fact that I had slept on her floor, and we were very good at it, both of us, which should have told me something about what kind of people we were. Okay, backing up. My name is Nate Brennan. I am 26 in this story. I do inventory systems for a medical supply distributor, which is the least interesting sentence a man can say about himself, and I say it a lot because it ends conversations, and I liked ending conversations. Alina Vasquez I have known since I was 6 years old. 3 pieces of that, and then we can move. The first one. We grew up 4 houses apart in a township outside Pittsburgh where the yards ran into each other and nobody fenced anything. There was a gap in the hedge between the Kowalski's place and ours, and by the time we were 8, that gap was a road. It had traffic. I could tell you what the underside of that hedge smelled like in August. I could tell you which branch you had to duck. Her father left when she was 9. I was there the week it happened in that yard, and I did not understand any of it, and she did not cry in front of me, and I have thought about that a lot since. I will come back to her father. He is more important to all of this than he has any right to be, and I did not understand why until I was 26 years old and standing in a courtyard getting taken apart. The second piece. We went to the same university. Everybody assumes that was arranged. It was not, and I know how that sounds, and I have stopped defending it. She got in first, I got in second. We did not plan a single semester together, and we ended up in the same statistics section anyway. And she turned around in her seat and looked at me and said, "You have got to be kidding me." And I have never in my life been happier to disappoint someone. The third piece. We graduated into the same city because that is where the jobs were, and we ended up in the same building because she found it first and called me and said the unit above hers was open and the landlord was a lunatic, but the rent was $440 a month. So I lived directly above her. For 2 years I could hear her television through the floor. I could hear when she got home. I could hear when she did not. Those walls were made of paper and good intentions, and they are going to matter later, so hang on to them. And in the unit across the courtyard was Julian. Julian moved in about a month after I did. He was the one who introduced himself, which neither of us would have done. He had a folding table and 2 chairs out in that courtyard within a week, and by the end of the summer that table was where all 3 of us ended up most nights, and if you had asked me, then I would have told you Julian Reyes was the best friend I had made since I was 6 years old. I would have told you that right up until the end. One more thing about me and then I will get to it. I have a habit. When I drink, I get very concerned that I am going to forget something important and I open the voice memo app on my phone and I talk into it. Grocery lists, things I meant to say. Alina used to make fun of me for it constantly. She said I was the only person alive who got drunk and started taking minutes. She said it was going to ruin my life one day. She was right, but not the way either of us thought. Now, I have been telling you this in the wrong order, and I did that on purpose because it is the same order I told it to her. It does not start with the whiskey. It starts 4 months earlier in October in that courtyard with Julian saying my name in a voice I had never heard him use before. Her father never told her mother he loved her. Not once in 15 years. I know that because Alina told me sitting in the gap in the hedge the fall we were both 9. She said it the way kids say enormous things like it was a fact about the weather. He never said it. And then he left. I heard it. I understood it. I was 9, so I understood it the way you understand a word you have not learned yet, which is to say I filed it somewhere and it sat there for 17 years without me touching it. 11 years later, I sat on 4 months of silence and did the exact same thing to her. That is the whole story, honestly. Everything else is just how long it took me to see it. October. It was one of those Pittsburgh nights in the middle of the month where the air finally turns and everybody comes outside to be in it. Julian had the folding table out. 2 beers, no third chair pulled up, which should have been my first clue because there was always a third chair. Alina was at her sister's for the weekend. Julian was doing this thing with the label on his bottle, peeling it in one strip, and he was not looking at me, and he said my name. He said Nate. And I said, what? And he said, I saw Grant on Thursday. Now, Grant Shaw had been Alina's boyfriend for 2 years at that point. I want to be fair to the man, so let me be fair to him where I can. He was not a monster. He was tall and he was easy in rooms and he laughed at things a half second before they were funny, and he had a way of putting his hand on the back of her neck that I had to teach myself not to look at. I hated him with a purity I have not achieved since. Julian said, he was at that place on Penn, the one with the patio. I said, okay. Julian looked at me then, and he said, he was not alone, man. I want to describe what happened in my body because it was not what I expected and I have never fully forgiven it. There was a drop, real physical in the stomach the way an elevator does it, and underneath the drop about a half second behind so close that I have spent years trying to prove to myself they were separate things. There was something else. There was a lift. I am not going to dress that up. A man told me my best friend was being cheated on and some small part of me, some room in the back I did not know was furnished, went bright. I said, you are sure? He said, I sat there for 20 minutes deciding whether to go over. I am sure. And then Julian did the thing. He picked up the strip of label he had peeled and he laid it flat on the table and he smoothed it out with 2 fingers and he said very reasonably, you are closer to her than I am. You should be the one who tells her. Here is what I thought that was at the time. I thought it was cowardice. Ordinary forgivable guy cowardice. Hand the grenade to the other guy and go inside. That is not what it was. It took me until the following spring to find out what it actually was, and when I did, it rearranged every conversation I had ever had with him. But that night, I took it. I said, yeah, okay, I will. And I did not. 4 months. I want to walk you through the 4 months honestly because the dishonest version is short, and the honest version is the entire point. I had 3 reasons. I built them carefully, and I maintained them, and I checked on them the way you check on something in the oven. Reason 1 was that I did not have proof. Julian saw a man on a patio with a woman. Julian saw them from across a street through a window at night. And Grant had a sister, and Grant had co-workers, and I was going to detonate 2 years of somebody's life over a sightline. Reason 2 was that it was not mine to carry. She would find out. These things surface. It was not my information, and it was not my relationship, and there is such a thing as staying in your lane. Reason 3 was the good one, the one I was proudest of. If I told her and she believed me, she would have to look at me every single day for the rest of her life as the man who told her. I would become the worst day of her life wearing a face she loved. I was protecting her from that. I was being selfless about it. I ran those 3 for 4 months and they held. They were load-bearing. I could have testified. There was a 4th one. I did not build the 4th one. It was just there in the room in the back, the one that went bright on a Tuesday in October, and it did not have words for a long time. When it finally got words in February at about 2 in the morning on a hardwood floor, they were these, if this ends, I get a chance. That is it. That is the whole 4th reason. 8 words. I kept a woman I had loved since I was 15 years old inside a lie for 4 months because I wanted a door to open, and I was so decent about it, so quiet and so careful and so decent that it took me almost a year to understand I had done anything at all. Silence is not nothing. That is the thing I did not know at 26. I thought silence was neutral. I thought it was the absence of an action. It is not. It is an action. It is one of the loudest ones there is, and you can do it every single day for 4 months or for 15 years, and the person on the other side of it feels every hour. Her father knew that. He did it for 15 years, and then he did the only honest thing he ever did, which was leave. I did not know it yet. I was about to. Because on the 11th of February at 11:40 at night, somebody knocked on my door. I knew before I opened it. Nobody knocks like that unless something has already happened. She was standing in the hallway in her work clothes with her keys still in her hand and her eyes swollen almost shut, and she looked up at me and she said, "I need you to not ask me anything for about 10 minutes. I gave her the 10 minutes. She came in and sat down on my couch and put her keys on the coffee table and did not take her coat off, and I went and stood in the kitchen with my back to her and made tea I knew she would not drink, because that is what you do when somebody asks you for 10 minutes. You find something to do with your hands in another part of the room. At minute 9, she said, "It was 6 months." I turned around. She said, "Her name is Danielle. She works in his building. It has been 6 months, and I found her earring in my own car, Nate, in the cup holder, and I picked it up and I thought, oh, that is not mine, and then I sat in a parking garage for 40 minutes with it in my hand." 40 minutes in a parking garage. I am telling you that number because I want you to have it. It is going to have a cousin later. I said, "Alina." She said, "Do not do the voice." I said, "What voice?" She said, "The one where you are about to be kind to me. I cannot take it yet." So I sat down on the other end of the couch and I did not do the voice, and she told me the rest of it flat, like a person reading a police report about somebody else. When she confronted him, what he admitted first, which was almost nothing, and then what he admitted second, which was everything at once, because that is how they do it. They let go of it in one piece, like dropping a bag they have been tired of holding. And then she stopped. I want you to notice that she stopped because I noticed it and I did nothing about it. It was a hitch. Half a second, maybe less. She was going down the list and she got to the end of the fight and she went to say one more thing and then she took it back into herself physically. I watched her do it, her jaw closed on it. And then she said, "And then he left." There was something else he said. I knew there was something else he said. And I let her keep it and I told myself that was respect. It was not respect. I was relieved. I had a thing I was not telling her, and she had a thing she was not telling me, and some animal part of me recognized the trade and took it. 2 people can build a very quiet room that way. We were about to live in one for a year. Then she said, "I hate that you are going to be nice about this." And that is when I stood up and got my jacket. I do not have a temper. I want to be clear about that because what happened next was not a temper, it was something worse. It was 4 months of a thing I had swallowed coming up all at once and looking for somewhere to go, and had found the nearest exit, which was Grant Shaw's apartment on 40th Street, 12 minutes away. I said, "I am going over there." She said, "No." I said, "Alina, 6 months. He sat at your table. He came to your mother's birthday." She said my name. I had my hand on the door, and she said, "Nate." And I stopped. And she said the sentence that I have gone back over more times than almost anything else in this story because at the time I thought it was about him. She said, "If you go over there, then this is the biggest thing that ever happened to me. Right now it is a thing that happened to me. Do not make it the biggest one." I stood there with my hand on the door. She said quieter, "I have already had one man decide what my life was going to be about. I would like to pick this time." I took my hand off the door. And she looked up at me from the couch, absolutely destroyed mascara everywhere, and she said, "Also, I have not eaten since yesterday, and if you have nothing in that fridge, I am going to lose my mind." And I laughed. God help me, I laughed, and so did she, this awful, wet, honking laugh, and she pressed the heels of both hands into her eyes and laughed and cried at the same time, and that was the moment the night turned. We went out. It was almost midnight on a Wednesday in February in Pittsburgh, which is not a time or a place that offers you much, but there is a place on Butler that does hot food until 1 and a state store 2 blocks the other way that closes at 11, and we made it with 4 minutes to spare. She picked the whiskey. She picked it specifically because Grant had once said something snobbish about it, and she carried it out of that store like a trophy. We got fried rice and dumplings and one of those enormous sodas nobody needs. We went back to her place because mine had dishes in it. She put on the playlist she has had since she was 17, the terrible one. We ate on the floor with the containers between us and our backs against the bed frame, and the radiator knocked twice and gave us nothing, and she got up and got the throw blanket and put it over both our legs. And we celebrated. That is what we called it. She held up a mug because she does not own glasses, and she said, "To the worst 2 years of my life." And I said something back, and she laughed so hard she had to put the mug down. I need you to understand that this was the happiest I have ever been in a room. I mean that literally. I have had better days since. I have had days I would not trade. But there has never been another hour in my life where I was that unguarded, sitting on a floor with the person I had loved since I was 15, watching her come back into her own face in real time. Around 1, she said, "You are doing your thing." I said, "What thing?" She said, "The thing where you are about to say something and then you file it." I said, "I do not do that." She said, "You have done it your entire life, Nathaniel," and she reached over and cracked the second bottle. That is where my memory stops. Not fades, stops. Like a cut in a film. Everything I am about to tell you about the next 4 hours I learned later, and I did not learn it all at once, and I did not learn it in order. Here is what I have from that night. All of it. It fits in a paragraph, and I have spent years trying to make it fit in 2. I have her laughing with her head back against the bed frame. I have the ceiling, which means I was lying down at some point before I meant to be. I have my own voice sounding wrong, too loud and too slow, the way your voice sounds when it is coming from inside your own skull instead of the room. I have the word 15, just the number in my mouth going out. And I have one image that is so clear it does not feel like memory at all. It feels like a photograph somebody handed me, her face very close to mine and completely still. Not smiling, not shocked. Still, listening the way you listen when somebody is saying something you are going to need later. That is it. That is the whole inventory. Now I have to tell you something about the morning, and I am not going to enjoy it. I already told you about the morning, right at the start. The gray light and the blanket and the knees. You have it. I left 3 things out. I want to be honest about the fact that I left them out on purpose and that I did it to you sitting here telling this 26 years old on a floor in a story I have had years to arrange. That is who you have been listening to. Keep that. The first thing I left out. My phone was on the table, not in my pocket. Not on the floor next to me where it would have been if it had fallen out. On her kitchen table, squared up, sitting there like something that had been set down deliberately by somebody with a free hand. I remember noticing it. I remember thinking, huh? And then I remember deciding not to think about it, which is a thing I am apparently able to do at 6 in the morning with no coffee in me. The second thing. There were 2 mugs in the drying rack, washed upside down, dry to the touch. Somebody had gotten up in the night in the dark in a room with a man passed out on the floor and washed 2 mugs and set them out to dry. That is not a thing you do because the mugs need washing. That is a thing you do with your hands because the rest of you has nowhere to go. The third thing. When I said I did not remember anything, she said me neither. She said it fast. I have gone over the speed of that answer more than any other detail in my life. It came back at me like a returned serve. There was no gap in it. No half second of a person actually consulting her own memory of a night she had lived through 6 hours ago, and I heard it, I heard the speed of it, and I let it go by because it gave me what I wanted. That is 3. Now you have the morning. We drank the coffee. We talked about the show. And then I put my shoes on the ones somebody had set by the door pointing out, and I went up 1 flight of stairs to my own apartment, and I stood in the middle of it for a while. And then I did the thing that decided the next 11 months. I did not check my phone. I want to be very careful here because this is the exact hinge of the entire story, and I have watched myself lie about it in my own head for years. The honest version is this. I stood in my apartment with my phone in my hand. I knew what I do when I drink. She had told me that same night 4 hours earlier, laughing that I get drunk and take minutes. I knew, and I did not open it. I put it face down on the counter and I went and took a shower. That is not forgetting. Forgetting is passive. That was a decision made by a man who already suspected what he would find and preferred a world where he had not found it. We were fine for about 3 days. That is the part people do not tell you about a thing like this. It does not go wrong immediately. There is a window where you both think you got away with it. She texted me on Thursday about a leak under her sink. I went down with a wrench and could not fix it, and we called the lunatic landlord together and made fun of his voicemail greeting. Friday, she knocked and asked if I wanted to walk to the place on Butler. We walked to the place on Butler, and somewhere around the following Tuesday it started. It was small. It was so small. She stopped coming up. That is all. For 2 years she had come up to my apartment maybe 4 times a week. No reason, no knock half the time, and now she did not. And instead she texted, and the texts were fine, the texts were normal, the texts were exactly as long as they had always been. And I did not go down. Because if I went down and she was strange with me, then something had happened. And if something had happened, then I had done it. And I could not remember doing it, so I could not apologize for it, so I could not fix it, so the only available move was to behave as if there was nothing to fix. She was doing the same math. I know that now. From the other side of a floor with a different set of facts and the exact same answer. 2 people who had never once been careful with each other were suddenly extremely careful with each other, and we were both immediately disgustingly good at it. We had the noise too. That is the thing about that building. I could hear her television. I could hear her get home. So there was never any relief in it. Never a stretch where you could pretend the person was far away and this was just distance. She was 11 feet below me. I could hear her laugh at something on a screen at 10 at night and know that she was not laughing with me and had not for 6 days. Julian noticed in about 2 weeks. He did not say anything for a while. He watched. He set up the folding table like always, and we all sat at it like always. And he watched the 2 of us pass the same 3 inches of air back and forth without touching it, and I could feel him clocking it. And I remember thinking at that table in the first week of March, he is going to make us fix this. I was so grateful. I actually felt grateful. That is the last thing I want to say in this part. Not because it is important yet, because of how it is going to sound later. March, April, May. I am going to give you those 3 months faster than I lived them because living them took a very long time. We had rules. Nobody wrote them down. Nobody agreed to them out loud. They just arrived the way rules do in a house where something has happened. Rule 1 was the courtyard. The courtyard was safe because Julian was in it. 3 people at a folding table is a different physics than 2 people in a room, and we both went out there like it was a demilitarized zone. 4 nights a week, sometimes 5. We were funnier at that table than we had ever been. That is what nobody tells you. We were hilarious that spring. Ask Julian. Rule 2 was that we did not touch. Alina is a toucher. She always has been. She used to grab my wrist to stop me talking, hook her chin over my shoulder to look at my screen, kick my leg under a table to make a point. All of that stopped in 1 week, and neither of us mentioned that it had. Rule 3 was texting. We texted constantly. More than before, honestly, and I think if you had pulled the transcripts, you would have said these 2 people are extremely close. Because text has no face in it. Text is a place where you can be exactly as warm as you used to be, and never once have to find out what the other person's eyes are doing. And Rule 4, the big one, the one that held the whole structure up, nobody says the word being February, or that night, or any construction that would point at it. We had a hole in the floor of our friendship the size of a car, and we walked around it every day gracefully like dancers, and we never once looked down. I got very tired that spring. I want to say that. It is exhausting in a way I did not have language for at 26. Performing ease is heavier than lifting things. And underneath it always the noise. Her television at 10. Her front door at 6:40 in the morning. The pipes when she ran the shower. The specific double knock of that radiator. I lived 11 feet above a person I was pretending to be normal with, and I could hear her being alive all night, and there were weeks where I would lie there and think she is right there. I could be down there in 9 seconds, and then I would think and say what? That was the wall I hit every time. And say what? I could not apologize for a thing I could not name. I could not ask what I said because asking what I said would tell her I did not know, and she had already told me she did not remember either. So asking would call her a liar. And if I called her a liar and I was right, then everything was worse. Do you see how neat that is? It is airtight. I built a box with no door and got in it, and then I was upset about being in a box. Now, Julian. Julian was magnificent that spring. I need you to hear that with no irony in it because there was none in me at the time. He was the one who kept the table set up. He was the one who noticed and did not push. He came up to my apartment maybe once a week, sat on my counter, drank my beer, and talked to me about it, and he was so good at it. Because here is what he did. He agreed with me. Every single time. Every angle I brought him, he took my side of it gently, thoughtfully, like a man who had considered the alternative. I would say, I think something happened, and I think it was me. And he would say, or you both got hammered, and she is embarrassed about something she said, and if you go down there and make it a whole thing, you are going to embarrass her twice. I would say, maybe I should just ask her. And he would say, ask her what, though? Walk me through it. What is the actual sentence you say when she opens the door? And I would try to build the sentence, and I could not build the sentence, and he would nod slowly and say, yeah, and we would drink. I would say, this is getting worse. And he would say, it is 3 months. You have known her 20 years. 3 months is nothing against 20 years. Every one of those was true. Every single one of them was reasonable. If you took any of them into a room and examined it, you would find nothing wrong with it at all. And every one of them ended with me not going downstairs. I did not see it. I want to be clear that I did not see it, not once, not for a second. And I do not think I would have seen it if I had lived that spring 3 times. He was not lying to me. He never lied to me. He just knew exactly which true things to hand a man like me, and he handed them over week after week with his feet on my counter and my beer in his hand. There is one night I think about. Late April. Rain. Alina had gone in early and gone to bed early, and the courtyard was wet, so it was just Julian and me on the stairs under the overhang. And out of nowhere he said, "Do you ever think about moving?" I said, "Out of the building." He said, "Out of the building?" I said, "No." And he said, "Yeah." And he looked out at the rain for a while. And he said, "I would not either." I thought that was solidarity. It was reconnaissance. By the last week of May, I had lost about 11 pounds, and I was sleeping maybe 5 hours, and my work had started to notice, and on a Tuesday I came out to the courtyard, and Alina was not there, and the table was folded up against the wall. Julian was standing next to it with his arms crossed. He said, "Sit down." I said, "There is no chair." He said, "Then stand up. I do not care." And he looked at me, and there was something in his face I had never seen in 5 years of knowing him, something worn through and out of patience. He said, "How much longer are you going to let this rot?" I said, "There is nothing to fix." Julian laughed. It was not a nice sound. He said, "Okay." And then he took his phone out of his pocket and started typing. I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I am texting her to come down." I said, "Julian." He said, "5 years I have watched you two do this," and he did not look up from the screen. "And I have been polite about it, and I am done being polite about it because you are both losing weight and neither of you is sleeping, and I can hear it, Nate. Through the wall, both of you, all night." I did not know that. I had never once considered that the wall went both ways for him too. Alina came down about 4 minutes later in a sweatshirt with her hair wet, and she saw the two of us standing there with the table folded against the wall, and she stopped at the bottom of the stairs. She said, "What?" Julian said, "Sit down." She said, "There is no chair." And I remember thinking very stupidly, in the middle of everything, there it is. That is the same joke. 20 years, and she still makes the same joke I make. Julian said, "Fine, stand. Both of you stand. I am going to say a thing, and then I am going to go inside, and you two are going to deal with each other like adults for the first time since February." Alina's face went flat. She said, "Do not." He said, "You have not been in a room alone together in 3 months." She said, "That is not your business." He said, "It became my business when I became the room." And she had nothing for that because it was true. Then he said it. I have played this back at half speed for years. Every word. Where his eyes were. What his hands were doing. He said, "Look, you want to know what actually happened here? Nothing happened. That is the entire problem. Nothing has ever happened because he does not do things, he sits on them. He has been sitting on things since October, and nobody has ever once called him on it." And then he stopped. That is the part. He stopped. He heard it. I watched him hear it one beat behind, saying it the way you hear a glass go off the counter before it lands. Alina said, "What?" Julian said, "Nothing." She said, "October." And she turned and looked at me. There is a look people get when they are not angry yet. When the information has arrived, but the meaning has not, and the face is just open, waiting, still willing to be told it is nothing. She had that for about 2 seconds, and it is the worst thing I have ever been looked at with because I knew I was about to take it off her. She said, "Nate, what is October?" And I could have lied. I want to be honest about the fact that the option was there and that I considered it. I stood in a wet courtyard in Pittsburgh and I ran the numbers on whether I could get away with it. I said, "Julian saw Grant with her in October." Nobody said anything. Then she said, "With who?" I said, "With Danielle." She said, "In October." I said, "The 17th. That is what did it, I think. Not the month, the date. Because a man who knows the date has been keeping it somewhere. She put one hand over her mouth. Not dramatic. Just held it there like she was keeping something from getting out. Then she took it away and she said, "November." I said, "Alina." She said Thanksgiving, I made him drive me to my mother's. December Nate, I bought him a coat. I sat in a parking garage in February with an earring in my hand for 40 minutes trying to figure out if I was insane and you had known since the 17th of October. I said, I did not have proof. And she said, do not. I said, it was not mine to say. And she said, do not, do not, do not. 3 times faster each time, and she was not crying, which was somehow so much worse. And then Julian said from about 4 feet away in a completely level voice, Alina, he was never going to tell you. We both looked at him. He was standing with his arms crossed, and he had this expression, and I did not have a word for it that night. I have one now. It was relief. Something had finally happened, and he did not have to carry it anymore. He said, I told him because I knew he would not. I want to be clear about that so nobody in this courtyard has to wonder about it later. He looked at me. I did not lie to you. Not once, not in 5 years. I gave you a true thing, and I stood back and watched, and you did the rest. You always do the rest. I said, you said I was closer to her. He said, you are. That is why it worked. I have thought about what I should have said. There is no version where anything I say there is any good. He did not push me. He did not trick me. He read me the way you read a schedule, and every single thing he did after that was built on the certainty that I would stand still. He was right. That is the part. He was right for 4 months. He said, I am going inside now. And he did, and he shut his door, and it was just the 2 of us in a wet courtyard at 9 at night. And Alina said very quietly, you know what my father did. I said, Alina. She said, you are the only person alive who knows what my father did. I told you in the hedge when we were 9 years old, and I have never said it out loud to another human being since. I said, I know. And she said, he did not do anything to us. That is what I need you to understand. He never hit anybody. He never yelled. He just did not say things for 15 years, and then one day the not saying was so big that he had to leave the house to fit it. She looked at me. She said, you had 4 months. She did not scream at me. I think I would have preferred it. She stood in that courtyard and she looked at me for a while, and then she said, I need you to not be near me. I said, for how long? And she said, I do not know, Nate. That is not a thing I can tell you. And she went up the stairs. Then she stopped on the landing and came back down 2 steps, and she said one more thing, and this is the one that actually took the skin off. She said, the worst part is, I would have believed you in October. If you had come to me on the 18th and said Julian saw something and I do not know what it means, I would have believed you because you have never once lied to me in 20 years. She said, that is what you spent. You had that and you spent it on nothing. Then she went inside. 9 days. That is how long I lasted before I did something stupid, and I want to be clear that at the time I thought it was the first non-stupid thing I had done all year. Grant Shaw lived on 40th Street in one of those newer buildings with a key fob and a lobby. I did not have a plan. I sat in my car across from it for 2 hours on a Thursday in June like a man in a bad film, and at about 7 he came out with a gym bag and I got out and said his name. He turned around. And here is the thing that undid all my preparation. He was not surprised. He looked at me the way you look at a bill you knew was coming. He said, Brennan. I said, I am not here to do anything. He said, I know. He put the gym bag down on the sidewalk. He said, you would have done it in October if you were going to do it. I said, how do you know about October? And he said, because your buddy stood across the street from that patio for 20 minutes and did not come in, and then nothing happened for 4 months. I am not an idiot. I spent 4 months waiting for a phone call that never came. I did not have anything to say to that. He had lived on the other side of my silence, and he had watched it hold week after week, and he had drawn exactly the correct conclusion about the kind of man I was. Then he said, you want to ask me something? Ask it. I said, when she ended it, what did you say to her at the door? He went very still. He said, she did not tell you. I said, no. And he laughed 1 syllable, no humor in it at all, and he said, of course she did not. He picked up the gym bag. He put it back down. And then he told me, and he did not soften it, and I think he wanted it to hurt, and I do not entirely blame him. He said, 2 years. I gave her 2 years. And I said, you have never once stopped saying his name. I said, do you know what it is like to be the placeholder in your own apartment? Every story starts with Nate. Every joke is a joke you 2 made in 1999. I said I did not lose you. I never had you. You have been at somebody else's table this whole time, and I was just the guy who drove you there. He said, and she did not deny it. She stood there in the doorway and she did not say one word. He picked up the bag again. He said, "I did a bad thing to her and I will carry it. But you two did something to me for 2 years and neither of you will ever call it anything." And he walked back into his building. I sat down on a low wall across the street. I want to describe what happened next accurately because it was not thinking. It was more like a room lighting up. "Placeholder." He said placeholder. And something in the back of my skull turned over the way a car does on the third try, and I heard my own voice. Not a scene, not the room, just my voice slow and too loud coming from inside my own head the way it does when you are past the point of hearing yourself from outside. 15. Since I was 15, that is what the number was. I had been carrying that syllable around for 4 months like a coin from a country I could not identify, and it was that. It was the front half of a sentence. "I have loved you since I was 15 years old." I said it, out loud in her apartment on the 11th of February with my back against her bed frame and her face about a foot from mine. I sat on a wall on 40th Street and I put both hands over my face and I laughed and people walked around me because of course that is what I said. There was never anything else in me to say. I had been carrying that sentence since the Clinton administration and I finally got it out and I was too drunk to keep it. And then the second thing arrived and it stopped the laughing. If I said that to her. Then she woke up the next morning knowing it. She sat on that bed with her knees up and her face arranged, and she watched me say I did not remember anything, and she said me neither, and she said it fast. Which meant she made a choice too. Which meant for 4 months, I had been the only one in the building who did not know what happened in that room. And I still did not know the part that mattered. Because a man says a thing like that, and then there is a silence, and then somebody answers. Somebody always answers. I did not know what she said. I did not go down there. I want you to understand how insane that is. I sat on a wall on 40th Street with the whole thing lit up in front of me, and then I drove home and I went up 1 flight of stairs past her door and I did not knock. Because now I had a new box, and this one had a lock on it that I had made myself. If I went down there and asked her what she said, I would be asking her to say it twice. Once to a man who was unconscious and once to a man who had just spent 4 months lying to her about October. She had told me 9 days earlier that I had spent 20 years of credit on nothing. And she was right, so what exactly was I going to walk in there with? So I did the thing I do. I waited. 3 weeks, June into July. The courtyard table stayed folded against the wall. Julian and I did not talk, not out of hostility, just because whatever we had was over and we both knew it and neither of us had the equipment to say so. And then on a Saturday in the middle of July, I came around the corner of the building and there was a rented van in the alley, and Alina was carrying a lamp out of her own front door. I stood there like a piece of furniture. She saw me. She set the lamp down on the pavement. She was wearing a shirt with paint on it that I had watched her get paint on 4 years earlier in a different apartment. I said, "You are moving." She said, "I am moving." I said, "Where?" She said, "Bloomfield. It is 11 minutes away. Nate, do not make the face." And I said, "Is it the job?" And she looked at me and something in her just gave out. Not dramatically. It was the look of a person who has run out of the energy required to manage another human being's feelings. She said, "No, it is not the job." She said, "It is that I can hear you." I did not say anything. She said, "Every night. I can hear you get home. I can hear when you do not. I can hear your chair when you push it back from the desk, and I know exactly what time you gave up on whatever you were doing. I have been able to hear you for 2 years, and for 2 years it was the best thing about that apartment." She picked the lamp back up and put it back down again. She said, "And now I lie there and I listen to a person walking around 11 feet above me who I am not allowed to talk to, and I have done that for 5 months and I cannot do it anymore. So yes, I am moving 11 minutes away, because 11 minutes is farther than 11 feet. And then because the universe has a sense of humor, it started to rain. Not hard. That summer Pittsburgh rain that does not commit. We both moved under the overhang at the mouth of the courtyard automatically the way you do after 20 years of standing in the same weather with somebody. And I said I talked to Grant. Her head came up. I said 3 weeks ago. I asked him what he said to you at the door. She said Nate. I said placeholder. He said you were at somebody else's table for 2 years. She turned away and put her hand flat against the brick. I said, "Why did you not tell me that?" And she said, without turning around, "Because you would have heard it as good news." That is the truest thing anybody said to me that year. I said I remembered something. She went absolutely still. I said, I remembered saying 15. I remembered the whole sentence, actually. About 3 weeks ago, sitting on a wall like an idiot. Rain on the pavement. The radiator knocking somewhere inside the building at somebody else. She said very carefully, how much? And I said the last honest thing I had, and I did not know yet how much it was going to cost. I said, that is all. I swear that is all. I have the sentence and then it stops. And she made a sound. I still do not have a good word for it. It was one exhale with a laugh caught in it, and it came out sounding broken in half. And she put both hands over her face, and she said into her hands, of course that is where it stops. I said, Alina. And she turned around and she was crying now properly for the first time since February, and she said, you want to know what happened after that? You said the most important sentence of my entire life, and then you passed out. Mid-word. You did not even land it. You went down onto that floor, and I sat there on my own bed for 40 minutes. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. She said, and then I answered you. Everything in me stopped. She said, I told you everything. I told you about the hedge. I told you I have known since I was 15, too, since the same summer, Nate, the exact same summer, and that I have watched you not say it for 11 years. I told you what Grant said at the door and that he was right and that I let him be right. I told you that I forgave you before I even knew there was anything to forgive. She said, I talked for 41 minutes to a man who was unconscious on my floor because it was the only way I was ever going to be able to say it. She wiped her face again. She said, and then the sun came up and you woke up and you looked right at me and you said you did not remember anything. She picked up the lamp. She said, so I said me neither, because what else was I supposed to do with it? She moved to Bloomfield. I helped. That is the part people always find strange when I tell this. I carried her bed frame down 2 flights of stairs the next morning with my hands shaking, and neither of us said one word about the night before, and then I drove the van because she hates driving anything larger than a sedan, and at the end of it we stood in an empty apartment that smelled like somebody else's paint, and she said, thank you, and I said, yeah, and I drove home. That was July. I am going to give you the next 4 months honestly, because everybody wants this part to be a montage, and it was not. It was slow. It was awkward. It was 2 people who had just found out they had been in love with each other for 11 years, and had between them managed to spend that entire time not saying it, which is not a foundation. That is a warning label. She did not want to be rushed. She had ended a 2-year relationship in February and found out in June that the man she had actually wanted the whole time had lied to her for 4 months. Anybody who thinks the next move is dinner and candles has never met a real person. So we did it backward and stupid and careful. We texted. Then we got coffee once in a place with other people in it, and it was so uncomfortable that we both laughed about it on the sidewalk afterward. Then we did not talk for 11 days. Then she called me at 9 at night to tell me about a woman at her office, and we stayed on the phone for 2 hours. Somewhere in there it started to be all right again. I fixed her sink in September. Badly. The lunatic landlord had to come anyway. In October, which I did not miss the significance of, and neither did she came to my mother's for a birthday because she has been coming to my mother's for birthdays since 1999, and my mother hugged her at the door and did not ask a single question, which is its own kind of miracle. I saw Julian twice that fall, both times by accident. The second time he said, you 2 figured it out yet? And I said, working on it. And he nodded and said, good. And there was nothing in his face I could use. I do not think he was sorry. I think he believed he had been the only person in that building willing to actually do something, and I have never been able to fully prove him wrong. He moved out the following spring. We do not talk. Now, November. There is a bar on Liberty that does trivia on Wednesdays, and we went with 4 people from her office, and Alina was drinking these things with elderflower in them that taste like nothing and are not nothing, and she had 4 of them. I walked her home. 11 minutes. And on the stairs outside her building in Bloomfield in the cold, she sat down on the 2nd step and pulled me down next to her and said my name in a voice I had not heard since a Wednesday in February. She said, Nate, I want to say the thing. I said, Alina. She said, no, listen, I want to say it out loud to your face with your eyes open because I have said it once already and it does not count when the other person is on the floor. And she said it. I am not going to give you every word. Some of it belongs to us. But she told me about the hedge and about being 15 and about a summer neither of us had ever mentioned again. She told me she had watched me not say it for 11 years and that at some point she had decided it was never going to happen and had gone and built a life around that decision, and that the life she built had a man in it who eventually told her the truth on his way out the door. She said, And I am not doing 11 more years. I would rather be wrong tonight than careful for another decade. Then she stopped and she looked at me and she was shivering and she said, "Okay, your turn." And here is what I did. I want you to watch me do this because it is the whole story. I looked at her on that step 4 drinks in the cold and I thought she is going to wake up tomorrow and remember all of it. And she is going to be embarrassed. And she has already been embarrassed once by me in a room for 5 months. And I thought I can give her the door. I can wake up and say I do not really remember the walk home. I can hand her the same exit she handed me in February. It would be a kindness. It would be the kindest thing anybody has ever done for her. That is how it presented itself. As kindness. It always does. Nobody in the history of the world has ever thought of themselves as a coward while they were being one. I opened my mouth to start it. And she said, "Do not." I said, "What?" She said, "I watched your face just do the entire thing." She was not shivering anymore. She had gone very steady. She said, "You were about to give me an out." I did not say anything. She said, "Do not ever do that to me again. Do you understand? Not once. Not to be nice, not to protect me, not because you have decided you know what I can handle." That is what he did. That is what my father did for 15 years, and he thought he was being gentle. She said, "Silence is not a gift, Nate. You just do not have to watch anybody open it." And I sat there on a cold step in Bloomfield, Pennsylvania at 11 at night, and I understood that I was about 8 seconds away from doing the exact thing I had done in February and calling it love. So I did not. I said, "I have loved you since I was 15 years old." She started to cry. She said, "Say it again." And I did. And we sat on that step for a while, and then we went upstairs, and I want to be clear that nothing happened because she was 4 drinks in, and I had just spent a year learning what it costs to have something important happen to a person who cannot hold on to it. I slept on her couch. She woke up at 7 and stood in the doorway of her own living room looking at me. And I said, "I remember everything." She said, "Good." We were together after that, properly, openly. For 3 months it was the best thing in my life, and I thought the story was over. The story was not over, because there was still a phone. It was February again, a year to the week. We were at her place in Bloomfield on a Sunday, and she was doing something on my phone looking up a restaurant. And my phone is old, and it does the thing where an app you have not touched in a year comes crawling back up to the surface. She went quiet. I was in the kitchen. I heard her go quiet, which is a thing you can hear if you have known somebody long enough. She said, "Nate." I came out. She had the phone turned around toward me, and on the screen was the voice memo list, and at the top of it, dated the 11th of February of the year before, was a file, 41 minutes and 6 seconds. I sat down. She said, "You have a recording." I said, "Yes." She said, "You made a recording that night." I said, "I did not mean to. I do it when I drink. You used to make fun of me for it." And she just looked at that screen for a long time. Then she said, "Have you listened to it?" And this is the part. This is the whole year right here in one question, and I had about 2 seconds to decide who I was going to be, and I want to tell you that the year had changed me and that I did not even hesitate. I hesitated. I sat on her couch and I felt the old thing come up in me, the smooth, reasonable thing. The thing that had run 3 explanations in October and would have run a 4th on a cold step in Bloomfield if she had not stopped me. It came right up. It had a sentence ready. It always does. And then I thought about a man leaving a house because the not saying had gotten too big to fit in it. I said yes. She did not move. I said, "At 6:10 in the morning, before you woke up." She did not move. I said, "The phone was on the table. I saw the file and I knew what it was, and I sat on your kitchen floor and I put it on and I listened to all 41 minutes of it. And then I put the phone back exactly where it was and I lay back down and I closed my eyes and I waited for you to wake up. And when you woke up, I told you I did not remember anything. The refrigerator did its thing where it hums and then stops. I said, I heard you say it. All of it. The hedge, the summer, the 15. What Grant said at the door. That you forgave me before you knew there was anything to forgive. I said I got everything I had wanted since I was 15 years old in one take at 6 in the morning, and then 20 seconds later I heard the other part, because I had forgotten what came first. That is the thing about that tape. Everybody hears the love. There are 11 minutes of it. But it is not the front of the recording. The front of the recording is me at 1:47 in the morning saying 3 things in a row in this order. I have loved you since I was 15 years old. Julian told me about Grant in October, and I did not tell you because if it ended, I got a chance. I said it. Out loud. In her apartment. I confessed the entire thing 4 months before Julian ever opened his mouth in that courtyard, and I confessed it to the only person it belonged to, and then I fell down and lost it. So at 6:10 in the morning, I sat on her floor with an earbud in, and I heard a woman say she loved me, and I heard a man tell her exactly why she should not, and they were both on the same tape, and the man was me. I said I could not have one without the other, so I put it down and I took the door instead. I said, I have been carrying that for a year. I let you tell me about the 41 minutes in the rain like it was news. That is the worst thing I have ever done, and I did not do it in February. I did it every single day for a year. And I stopped, and I waited for it to be over. Alina put my phone face down on the table, and she said, I know. I said, what? She said, I know, Nate. And she pulled her knees up to her chest, both arms around them, and I have told you about that. I told you in the first 30 seconds of this. That is the thing she does when she is about to say something she has been holding. She said, you left the screen on. I could not speak. She said, I got up at about 6:20, and your phone was on my table, and it was face up, and the screen had not gone dark yet, and the little bar was all the way at the end. She said, I stood in my own kitchen and looked at it for maybe 10 minutes. She said, and then I went and sat back down on the bed, and I put my knees up, and I waited for you to open your eyes. The rain thing outside, a car going down Liberty. She said, you said you did not remember anything, and I said me neither. She looked at me. She said, so do not sit on my couch and tell me you are the only one who did this. I said, why? And she said, because you had just told me why you did it on that tape in your own voice, and I did not know yet whether I could live with it, and I was not going to make a decision that size at 6 in the morning. She said, and then it got easy. That is the part I am ashamed of. It got so easy. Every week it got easier not to say it. I woke up one day in July and I was standing in an alley with a lamp in my hand telling you about 41 minutes like you had never heard them. She said, you are not the only coward in this. You are just the loudest one about it. And then we sat there. I do not know for how long. Long enough that the light in that apartment changed. And then she said, play it. I said, Alina. She said, play the whole thing, both of us. Out loud in this room at the same time. She wiped her face with her wrist the way she does. She said, I have heard it once, and you have heard it once, and neither of us has ever heard it with anybody. So I picked up the phone and I turned the volume all the way up and I set it on the table between us. And I pressed play. And a room from a year ago came into that room, her old radiator knocking twice. A playlist she has had since she was 17. 2 people laughing at something we could not identify anymore and never have. We listened to all 41 minutes. Neither of us said one word while it played. We got married in the fall 2 years later in her mother's backyard. Small. Her mother cried the entire time. Her father was not there. She did not invite him. I asked her once if she wanted to, and she said no. And then a week later she said, he would not know what to say anyway. And that was the last time either of us has mentioned him. We still have the recording. It has been backed up 4 times across 3 phones. I do not know what we are supposed to do with it eventually. I do not think there is a protocol for that. Here is what I have. I spent 4 months telling myself that silence is a neutral thing, that it is the absence of an action. It is not. I know that now. It is the loudest thing I have ever done, and I did it to a woman who had already sat in one house for 15 years, listening to a man not say something, and I did it while telling myself I was being kind. We are not judged by what we say. Almost nobody is. There is not much courage in the good version of a sentence. We are judged by the 4 months. By the room you were in when you knew the true thing and the door you were standing next to and what you decided in the half-second before you decided to wait. A doctor once told a man that he would never be a father. Somebody once told me that the best thing I could do for a person I loved was leave her a way out. Both of those are the same lie. It is the lie that sounds like mercy and works like a lock. She had it right on that step in the cold 4 drinks in and shivering, and it is the only thing out of this entire year that I would want anybody to carry away from it. Silence is not a gift. You just do not have to watch anybody open it. If you have been sitting on something and you know exactly what it is and you have 3 very good reasons and a 4th one you have not looked at in a while, I would like to hear about it. Put it in the comments. Tell me how long it has been and tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight, because it gets me every time seeing how far these things travel. And be honest with me before you go. If you had woken up on that floor with that phone on that table and you already knew what was on it, would you have told her that morning, Or would you have taken the door the way I did and told yourself it was kindness? There is no wrong answer. There is only the one you would have to live next to. If this one got you, tap the like button so it finds the next person who needs it. Subscribe and turn the bell on because I am here every week with another story about the things people almost said. Say it out loud. That is all any of us can do.